I've buried good horses and I've buried good men, and I've never once been sure I knew the difference in how much it hurt. But I'll tell you the truth, there's a thing I saw one winter that I have never told straight, because every time I try, people lean in too eager like they already know how it ends. They think they want the part where the town cries and the church fills up and somebody plays a fiddle too slow. That part happened. I'm not going to lie about it. What I want you to understand first is what came before that. The cold of it. The not knowing. A horse standing in my yard at the wrong hour, doing a thing horses don't do, and me too stupid and too tired to understand what he was asking for, until I'd nearly wasted the only hour that mattered. So before you decide you've heard this one, about a loyal animal and a dying cowboy and a town that came together, let me walk you back to the start, to the night I almost got it wrong. Because the whole thing turns on a few minutes I didn't deserve to get back. And if you sit with me through the cold part, the warm part will mean what it's supposed to mean. Stay with me, I'll tell it the way it happened. The dog wouldn't quit, and that's the only reason I got up. It was the third week of January, the dead stretch where the sky goes the color of a nickel, and stays that way for days, and I had been asleep maybe 2 hours when Red started in at the door. Not his coyote bark, not the deep one he saved for strangers. This was the high, broken sound he made only when something was wrong in a way he couldn't name. The same sound he'd made the spring the irrigation ditch took a calf. The same sound from the morning my wife didn't wake up. A dog learns the shape of catastrophe before you do. I've stopped arguing with him about it. I lay there a minute anyway. I'm not proud of that minute. A man my age, alone on a place too big for him, learns to ration what he'll get out of bed for, and the first thing the cold teaches you every winter is that most emergencies aren't yours. Coyote on the calves, not yours till you see blood. Truck on the county road, not yours. I told myself it was wind. I told myself Red was old and dreaming. Then I heard the other sound under the dog, and I knew it wasn't wind. It was a horse, out in my yard, stamping, not the lazy shift of a horse in a corral, but that hard, repeated strike of a hoof on frozen ground, over and over, a knocking, like a fist on a door, and blowing those long, blubbering snorts a horse makes when it's been pushed past what it had and is standing there with nothing left, sides heaving, asking. I got up then, pulled my coat on over my long johns, jammed my bare feet into boots and went out without my hat, which tells you I wasn't thinking because I never go out without my hat. The cold took the skin off my face the second I opened the door. 12 below, the thermometer said later. The kind of cold that isn't weather anymore, that's just a flat hostility, a thing that wants you to lie down. And there he stood. In the wash of light from my porch bulb, steam rolling off him in sheets, was a horse I didn't know. A bay gelding, big through the chest, getting on in years, you could see the gray salting his muzzle even through the rime of frost on his whiskers. He was saddled. That was the first thing that turned my stomach to water. A saddled horse, alone in my yard at 3 in the morning in January. The reins weren't tied off. They were dragging dirty, one of them broken short like he'd stepped on it and snapped it. His near flank was scraped raw and weeping, the hair gone in a long stripe, the way a horse gets when he's gone down hard and dragged himself up again. Maybe more than once. He saw me and he didn't shy. That was the second thing. A strange horse run ragged, hurting by every rule I knew he should have spooked off into the dark the second a door opened. Instead he swung his big head toward me and let out a sound I had never heard a horse make. Not a whinny. Lower. A groan almost pushed out through his teeth, and he struck the ground again with that frozen hoof, knock, knock, and took a step toward the gate. Then stopped, looked back at me, took another step, stopped. I have replayed those next few seconds more times than I can count, and I am ashamed of every version. Because I didn't understand. I want to be honest with you about that, since everybody who tells this story later made me out smarter than I was. They'd say it at the feed store and all Walt. He knew right off, he saddled up and no. I didn't know right off. I stood in my yard freezing, looking at a wrecked stranger's horse, and the first clear thought I had was, Somebody's been thrown and the fool rode off without telling a soul where he was going, and now I've got to deal with it. The first thing I felt wasn't pity. It was irritation. The tired, mean irritation of a man who's been woken in the cold and resents the world for needing him. I went to the horse, got a hand on his neck, and he was hot, soaking, lathered under the saddle blanket in a way that scared me, because a horse that hot in that cold is a horse that's run himself toward dying. His legs were trembling, not from fear, from depletion. He'd come a long way, and he'd come it fast, and he'd come it on a body that didn't have it to give. I checked the saddle for a brand, a name, anything. There was a rifle scabbard empty, a coil of rope, and on the cantle worked into the leather 3 letters I knew, E.T. And my stomach dropped clean through the frozen ground. Because there was only one E.T. within 30 miles, and that was Eli Trace, who ran a few hundred head up in the breaks north of my place, alone, the way he did everything, a closed-off, leathery, hard-handed man I'd spoken maybe 40 words to in 15 years. We weren't friends. I'm not sure Eli Trace had a friend in the world. He'd buried his wife before I ever moved out here, and somewhere along the way he'd buried the part of himself that talked to people too. He came to town for salt and coffee and nails, paid in exact change, and left. People called him sour. People who'd never spent a winter alone called him sour. And this was his horse, standing in my yard, saddled, riderless, gone down hard, run half to death, knocking on my door. It still took me too long. I'm telling you the worst part now so you don't think this is a story about a clever man. I went and got a halter, thinking I'd put the horse up, get warm, call the sheriff, and let the county sort it out by daylight. I had the halter in my hand, and I was reaching for his head when he did the thing that finally broke through to me. He pulled away. This exhausted animal who'd let me handle him, who hadn't shied at a stranger. When I came at him with that halter to put him up, he threw his head and backed off and turned toward the gate and the dark country beyond it. And he made that groan again, louder, and slammed his foot down and looked at me. And I swear before God the look was a question, and the question was, why won't you come? He didn't want to be put up. He didn't want to be safe. He'd run himself to the edge of his own life to get to a lit window, and now that he had a human standing in front of him, the only thing he wanted was for that human to follow him back. That's when I understood. Late. 8 minutes, maybe 10, after I'd come outside. 8 minutes I'll be paying on the rest of my life. I dropped the halter. I said, and it's a foolish thing talking to a horse, but I said it, where is he? Show me where he is. And the horse turned and went for the gate. I didn't take my truck. You couldn't have got a truck up where we were going, not in the dark, not over that ground, and I think some part of me already knew that. I threw a saddle on my own horse, a steady old roan mare named Dot who'd forgotten how to be surprised by anything, and I loaded what I could grab in the dark, a horse blanket, the wool one off my own bed, a flashlight, the bottle of whiskey I keep for nothing good, a length of rope, and the cell phone that gets 1 bar on a clear day and none that night. I called the sheriff's line as I rode out of the yard. It rang into the dark and a recording told me to leave my name. I left it. I gave the only direction I had, which was north, into the breaks, behind Eli Trace's place, and even saying it I knew how useless it was, because the breaks were 40 square miles of folded, broken country, draws and cutbanks and dead-end coulees, and a man could lie down out there 10 feet from a trail and not be found till spring. But I didn't have to find him. The horse found him. I have been around animals my whole life, and I have never seen anything like what that bay gelding did that night, and I've stopped trying to explain it, because every explanation cheapens it. He didn't lead me the way a trained horse leads. He led me the way a thing leads that has only one purpose left in its whole body. He set out at a trot, exhausted as he was. He set out at a trot, and when I fell behind he stopped and waited, stamping, blowing, until Dot caught up, and then he went on. He took us off my road and onto Eli's, and off Eli's onto a cattle trail, and off the trail into country with no trail at all, down into a black draw where the cold pooled like water and the stars disappeared behind the cutbank walls, and my flashlight made a little useless circle on ground that all looked the same. And the whole way I kept thinking, it's been hours. That was the thought that rode with me, because I could read the horse's body. A horse doesn't lather like that in 10 minutes. He'd been at this a long time. He'd found his man down somewhere out here, God knew when, and he'd stood with him. And at some point, and this is the part I can't get past, at some point that horse had made a decision. He'd decided his man wasn't getting up. He'd decided to leave him, which every instinct in a horse screams against, because a horse alone in the dark is a horse for the killing. And he'd gone off into 40 miles of black country to find a light. Found my light. The wrong light, maybe. I wasn't the nearest place. Eli's own house was nearer. But maybe Eli's house was dark and empty, and a dark house is no help. And somewhere in whatever a horse has instead of reasoning, he'd known to keep going till he found a window with a man behind it. And all of that took time. Time Eli Trace had been lying out in 12 below dark, however he'd come to be lying there. We went down into the last draw and the horse stopped. He just stopped in the bottom of it and dropped his head and stood. And I knew before my flashlight found anything. I knew from how the horse stood, not alert, not waiting anymore, but settled, the terrible settledness of an animal that has finally delivered the thing it was carrying and has nothing left to do but stand over it. I got down off Dot. My legs didn't want to hold me. I'd been clenched against the cold so long I'd half frozen in the saddle. I swung the light around the bottom of the draw, over rock and frozen mud and a fallen cottonwood, and then it caught a shape, and the shape was a man. He was down at the foot of the cutbank on his side, one leg bent wrong underneath him. Near him, half buried in the loose shale, was the carcass of a heifer, and even in that moment, in that light, I could read what had happened the way you read sign, which is to say partly true and partly a story I told myself. A cow gone down in the draw. Eli come to pull her out or doctor her, alone in the dark, the way he did everything alone. The bank giving way. A horse and a man and a falling wall of frozen earth, and the man coming off bad and the leg, and the cold moving in while he lay there. The horse going down too, maybe, that raw stripe on his flank and the horse getting up, and the man not. I got to him and I got my hands on him, and he was so cold. I want to tell you he was warm, that there was time, that I'd ridden in like the cavalry. He wasn't warm. He was cold as the ground he was lying on, and for one black second I was sure, dead sure, that the horse had run himself half to death and torn me out of my bed and led me 40 miles into the breaks to stand over a dead man. Then Eli Trace breathed. Just barely. A breath so shallow and so slow that I had my ear an inch from his cracked lips before I caught it, a thread of warmth in all that cold, in and out, and a long, long nothing, and then in again. Alive. The man was alive. Past the edge of what a body's supposed to survive, hours into a freeze that should have taken him, and he was alive. And I have thought 1,000 times since about what kept him on the right side of that line, and I don't have a clean answer, but I know what was standing over us in the dark while I worked. The horse came close while I got my own wool blanket under Eli and the horse blanket over him, while I rubbed his hands and cursed and prayed and tried to remember a single useful thing about a frozen man and came up with nothing but keep him warm, keep him breathing, get him out. The horse came close and put his big frosted head down low, down by Eli's face, and breathed on him. On his neck, his cheek. Slow, warm clouds of horse breath in the cold. And Eli Trace, who hadn't moved, who I'd have sworn couldn't move. Eli's hand came up off the frozen ground, a half inch, an inch, shaking, and his fingers found the horse's jaw and just rested there. He knew, even gone as far as he was gone, the man knew his horse was there. And the horse stood and let himself be touched and did not move from over us. Not while I worked, not while I got Eli onto Dot the only ugly way one man can move another, not the whole long terrible climb back up out of the draw toward the one bar of cell signal and the headlights I'd finally see coming. He stayed at Eli's stirrup the entire way, that ruined, salt-flecked, half-dead horse, matching his steps to ours, his shoulder against my hip, like he had decided that having found his man he was never going to be more than 3 feet from him again, as long as either of them lived. I haven't told you the horse's name yet. I didn't know it that night. I learned it later in the warm from a man who could barely talk, but I'll give it to you now, because you've come this far in the cold with me and you've earned it, and because everything that came after, the thing the town did, the part everybody thinks they already know, all of it turns on this animal, and a thing that loyal ought to be called by its name. His name was Banner. And the part of this story that breaks people's hearts isn't that Banner saved Eli Trace that night. It's what we learned in the weeks after about why a horse like that existed at all, about who Eli Trace had been before he went sour, and what he'd lost, and the one promise he'd made to a dying woman that he'd kept alone in the breaks for 11 years where nobody could see. But that's the next part. Let me get the man to the hospital first. Let me get us both warm. They told me at the hospital he should have died, and they said it like an accusation, the way doctors do when a body breaks their rules. Severe hypothermia, core temperature they wouldn't even tell me the number on, a femur snapped clean, 3 ribs, frostbite that cost him the last 2 joints of 2 fingers on his left hand, dehydration, exposure, shock. The young doctor couldn't have been 30, city kid doing his rural rotation, kept looking at the chart and then at me like I was hiding something. How long was he out there? He kept asking. And I kept saying I didn't know, because I didn't. And finally I said the thing that made him stop asking. I said his horse kept him alive. And the kid did a thing I didn't expect. He didn't smile that thin smile city people do at country talk. He set the chart down and he said, "Quiet, I read about that. Animals lying with people, there've been cases." And then even quieter, almost to himself, "He shouldn't be here. Something kept him warm enough, long enough." He looked at his chart again. 3, 4 more degrees down and there's no coming back. Whatever held him at that line held him right at it. I drove home from the hospital at dawn, and I thought about Banner standing over us in that draw, breathing on a freezing man's face, and I had to pull the truck over on the county road because I couldn't see to drive. Here's what I want you to understand about Eli Trace before I tell you what we found out, because it matters. Nobody in that town liked him. I don't mean they hated him. Hate takes more energy than people had to spare for Eli. They just didn't like him, in the low background way of a town that's decided a man and filed him. Sour Eli. Cheap Eli, exact change. Never a dime for the church raffle. Cold Eli, who'd let your wave die on the air and look right through you in the feed store. The kind of man a small town keeps a careful, mild contempt for, the way you keep a chipped cup you can't be bothered to throw out. I'd done it too, I want to own that. 15 years his neighbor and I'd filed him same as everybody. Sour old Eli, easier than wondering. So when word got around, and it got around in a day, the way everything does, that Eli Trace was in the hospital half froze, and that his old horse had run 40 miles through the breaks in the dark to fetch help, the town's first reaction wasn't what you'd hope. The town's first reaction at the feed store, at the diner, was a kind of mild, chewing interest. That's so. Eli Trace, huh? Lucky. A story to turn over. Not yet a thing that moved anybody. What moved them came later, and it came from his house. See, Eli was going to be weeks in the hospital, then weeks more in a chair. And a man's cattle don't stop being hungry because he's broke in two. Somebody had to see to his place. And since I was the one who dragged him out, it fell to me, and I didn't mind it. And I drove up to the Trace place that next afternoon to feed his stock and check his water and put his horse Banner, who they'd sent home with me, too beat up to do anything but mend back where he belonged. I'd never been inside Eli Trace's house. Nobody had that I knew of, in 15 years. I'm not going to pretend I went in for a noble reason. I went in because it was cold and I wanted to make sure his pipes hadn't burst and his fire was out, and there was nothing in there going to burn the place down. I let myself in the back, the way you do out here, and I stood in another man's kitchen, and I felt like a thief. It was a poor house. Clean, but poor, poorer than a man running that many head had any business living in, and I understood the exact change then, the no dime for the raffle. He didn't have the dime. He'd been pouring everything into that land for years and living like a hermit on the leavings. But that wasn't the thing. The thing was the walls. Because that closed-off, sour, look-right-through-you man had covered the walls of his house with a woman. Photographs, drawings she'd been an artist or near enough. There were little framed pencil sketches of horses, of the breaks, of a younger Eli laughing, a thing I could not have imagined his face doing. And photographs everywhere, a whole life of them. A wedding, the two of them impossibly young in front of a courthouse. The two of them on horseback. Her on a porch I didn't recognize, pregnant. And I had to sit down at his kitchen table when I understood it. Then no more pregnant pictures, and no baby pictures, and a small framed thing on the mantel I made myself walk over and look at. And it was a hospital bracelet, the tiny kind, the kind they put on a newborn and a date. And beside it her bracelet, the grown-up kind with the same date. And I stood in Eli Trace's poor clean house, and I understood that he had lost them both on the same day. The woman and the child together, 11 years ago, and that he had been alone in that house with these walls every single night since. And on the table, where a man would see it every morning of his life, was a framed photograph turned to face his chair. And it was her, the woman, young and squinting into the sun, sitting bareback on a leggy bay colt with a white blaze, and the colt was unmistakable, even young, even all legs, and on the back of the frame in a man's hard pencil were the words. She named him Banner, said keep him whatever it costs, I will. I learned the rest in pieces. Over the weeks Eli mended, because something cracked open in that man after the breaks, the way the deep cold can crack a stone that stood 100 years, and he started, haltingly, to talk. To me mostly, since I was the one there. I'd sit by his hospital bed and then his chair, and he'd give it to me in fragments, looking at the wall, never at me. Her name was Carol. She'd been the warm one, the one who'd made the town like him back when, because you couldn't not like a man Carol loved. The colt had been hers, a foal she'd helped pull on a bad night, a foal nobody thought would live, and she'd sat up with it and she'd named it Banner because, she said, it carried itself like it was leading a parade even when it was a knock-kneed thing that couldn't stand right. Keep him whatever it costs. She'd said it laughing, the way you say a small thing. Then she was gone. Her and the baby both, in the kind of bad night that medicine out here can't always fix, and Eli was left in a house full of her drawings with a half-grown colt she'd named, and a promise he'd made without knowing it was the last one. So he kept it, that's all. That's the whole secret of Eli Trace, the sour man, the cheap man, the man who looked through you in the feed store. He'd had nothing left to keep but a horse and a promise, and he'd kept them alone where nobody could see for 11 years. He'd never sold Banner, though there were years a sale would have saved his place. He'd never worked him hard enough to break him down young, never gambled him on a hard cattle drive when he was in his prime. He'd kept that horse easy, kept him whole, the one easy whole thing in a hard, broken life, because a dead woman had said keep him whatever it costs, and Eli Trace was a man who, it turned out, would pay any cost there was rather than break a word given to someone he couldn't get back. And the cost had been high. The cost had been everything. The cost had been himself. The warmth burned out of him. The town turned cold to him, because a man who pours all his love into one silent vessel and parks it where nobody can see looks from the outside, exactly like a man with no love at all. And then one January night a heifer went down in a draw, and a closed-off man went out alone in the dark to do what he always did alone, and the bank came down, and the one thing he'd kept whole for 11 years, the one creature on earth that knew the true measure of Eli Trace, that had been loved when nothing else was, that animal stood over him. And then it did the only thing it could think to do. It went and got help, whatever it cost. The horse kept the promise too. You see that, don't you? Keep him whatever it costs. She'd meant it about the horse, but it ran the other way in the end. The horse kept Eli, whatever it cost, 40 miles, a torn flank, a body run to the edge of dying. Loyalty doesn't know which direction it's supposed to point. It just points at the one you love and it goes. I told it, that's the part I have to confess. I didn't mean to make it a thing, I'm not a man who talks, but somebody at the feed store said the old sour Eli, lucky old coot line won too many times in front of me, 3 weeks in, and something turned over in me and I told them. About the walls. About Carol and the baby and the same date. About keep him whatever it costs penciled on the back of a frame. About a man who'd kept a promise alone in the breaks for 11 years while the whole town decided he had no heart, when the truth was he had too much of one and nowhere left to put it. I watched it land. I watched the diner go quiet. I watched a woman I'd known 30 years, Marge, who ran the register and had called Eli sour to my face more than once. I watched her face come apart, and she set down the cup she was holding and she said, 11 years. He sat up there 11 years and she couldn't finish it. That's where it turned. Not at the rescue. The rescue was just an old man and a good horse and a cold night. It turned in a diner 3 weeks later when a town that had filed a man under sour had to take the file out and read what was actually written there, and found it was a love story all along, and that they'd been the ones too cold to see it. What the town did next is the last part, and I'll tell you now so you'll come back for it. It wasn't a casserole and a card. It was bigger and stranger than that, and it cost some of them something real, and it has to do with Banner, and with a thing Eli asked me for from his hospital bed that I argued with him about hard, because I thought it would kill him. But I'll get to that. Eli asked me to put Banner down. That's the thing I argued with him about. I have to start the last part there, with the worst sentence in it, because I spent a lot of the spring not understanding it, and I owe it to you not to smooth it over. He asked me on a gray afternoon in his hospital chair, looking at the wall the way he did, and he said it flat the way he said everything. When I'm gone, and I'll be gone before that horse should be, the shape I'm in I want you to see to him. Don't let him go to a sale ring. Don't let some weekend cowboy ride him into the ground for fun. He's near 30. He gave me everything. When his time comes, I want it clean, and I want it home, and I want it to be somebody who, and he stopped, and his jaw worked, somebody who knows what he is. I told him no. I told him he was alive, the horse was mending, and we weren't going to sit in a hospital planning funerals. I was sharp about it. I'd grown to, I don't know the word. Eli and I had grown into something in those weeks. Not friendship exactly, something older men make instead, a thing without a name. And the idea of it made me angry, the whatever it costs of it, the way the man's whole life kept coming down to paying. But I understood him better than I let on, and here's what I understood. Eli Trace had spent 11 years terrified of one thing, and it wasn't dying. It was leaving Banner behind to a world that didn't know what the horse was. He'd kept the horse whole all those years, partly out of love, and partly out of a low animal dread that he'd die first, and the last keeping of Carol's promise would fall into careless hands. He wasn't asking me to kill his horse. He was asking me to promise that the one whole thing in his life wouldn't outlive him into indignity. He was trying to hand the promise on. Keep him whatever it costs. And now the cost was somebody to stand where Eli had stood. So I changed what I told him. I said, I'm not going to promise to put him down. I'll promise you this. Whatever Banner needs, long as I'm breathing, Banner gets. Easy work or no work. Home ground. And when it's his time, his real time, not yours, it'll be me, and it'll be gentle, and it'll be at home, and I'll know what he is. He looked at me then, actually looked, which he almost never did, and he nodded once, and that was the most either of us was going to say about it, and it held. It's still holding, but I'm ahead of myself. Here's what the town did. I told you it wasn't a casserole. Word of the walls, of Carol, of the baby, of keep him whatever it costs, went through that valley like water finds the low ground, and it changed the temperature of the whole place toward one man, overnight, the way I've only seen a few times in my life. But a town feeling bad about itself, is just a town feeling bad about itself. What mattered was a few people decided to do something with it, and the thing they decided to do was this. They were going to keep Eli Trace's place running until he could run it himself, and they were going to do it without letting him pay, because the whole sickness of the thing was that Eli had never once let himself take. He'd given everything to that land, that promise, that horse, and never taken a dime or a hand from anybody, because taking meant being known, and being known was the one cost he couldn't pay. So the town's gift to him, the real one, wasn't labor. It was the much harder thing of making a proud, closed man let himself be carried, and doing it in a way he couldn't refuse. They were sly about it. They knew him. Marge from the diner organized it, but she never once called it charity. They framed every bit of it as owed. The Hutchins boys went up and calved out Eli's heifers in March, brutal, sleepless work. And when Eli tried to protest from his chair, the older Hutchins just said his own daddy had bought cattle off Eli's father 40 years back at a fair price in a bad year, and this was the books getting squared. Take it up with the dead if he didn't like it. The vet, Dr. Pell, drove out and saw to Banner's frostbit flank and the strained tendons and wouldn't write a bill, said he was running a study on cold weather injuries, and Banner was data, which was a lie so kind I had to leave the barn. Somebody re-shingled the linta that had been letting weather onto Eli's hay for years. Somebody, I never learned who, left a cord of split wood by his door, and when Eli demanded to know who so he could pay them, nobody would confess, the whole town conspiring in a single soft refusal to let him settle up. And one Sunday in April, when Eli was home in his chair but still couldn't walk out to see his own stock, the church did a thing. They didn't tell him. They moved their whole afternoon up to the Trace place. Not for a service. Nobody was fool enough to spring a service on Eli Trace. But for a branding, his branding, the spring work he couldn't do, 30 people and a dozen horses and a fire and the whole loud ordinary business of it, done for him in his yard, where for 11 years no living soul had come. I was there. I wheeled him out onto his own porch to see it, and I watched the most closed man I ever knew look out at his land covered in people who'd come to keep his place alive, and I watched him try to hold his face the way he'd held it for 11 years, and I watched it fail him. Just go. Right there on the porch. And Marge came up and didn't say a thing about it, didn't make him be seen crying, just put a cup of coffee in his good hand and stood beside his chair looking out at the work, so he wouldn't have to be looked at. And that small mercy, that letting a proud man weep without witness in the middle of a crowd, that's the kindest thing I have ever seen people do, and they did it for a man they'd called sour 100 times. That's what moved the town, not the rescue, the reckoning. A whole valley finding out it had been cold to a man whose only crime was loving too hard and too privately, and the valley deciding, late but real, to be warm to him out loud. Eli Trace lived 2 more years. I'll give it to you straight because he'd want it straight, and you've been honest company this whole way. The breaks took something out of him that didn't come back. The cold gets into an old body and stays, and he was never sound again, and a bad heart finished what the draw had started, 2 springs later in his sleep in his own house, with Carol's drawings on the walls. I found him. He looked easy. I want you to know that. After all of it, he looked easy. But those 2 years weren't nothing. Those 2 years he let people in. Slow and stiff and grumbling, he never did turn into a friendly man, and I'd have distrusted it if he had. But he'd let the Hutchins boys help with the gather and not fight them on it. He came to town and Marge would have his coffee poured before he reached the counter, and he'd let her. And once, Marge told me this, crying and laughing at the same time. Once he left a 5 in the church raffle jar, exact change be damned, and walked out before anybody could make it a thing. He got 11 years worth of being known, packed into 2, and I have to think it was enough. I think he got to set the promise down at the end knowing it wouldn't fall into careless hands. Because here's the part I haven't told you. Banner outlived him. Carol's horse, near 30, the one whole thing, he outlived the man he dragged 40 miles through the dark to save. And he came to me, the way Eli and I had settled it, and he lives on my place now, in the home pasture where I can see him from the kitchen window, and he does no work at all, and he eats better than I do. And on the cold mornings I put a blanket on him before I put a coat on myself. He's old now, old the way you can't fix. And I know I'm not a fool. I've buried good horses. I know whose hand it's going to have to be, and I know it's coming this winter or the next, and I know what I promised. It'll be me, and it'll be gentle, and it'll be at home, and I'll know what he is. Keep him whatever it costs. The promise came all the way down the line to me, from a dead woman to a sour man to a neighbor who didn't even like him for 15 years. And now I'm the one who carries it, and I'll pay it when it comes due, gentle, at home, the way you keep the only kind of promise that ever really mattered. But not yet. This morning he was at the fence when I came out, gray in the muzzle, that old white blaze, breath steaming in the cold the same as it steamed in the draw the night he found us. And I stood there with my coffee, and I put my hand on his jaw the same place Eli's frozen hand had found it, and he leaned his big head into me, easy, whole, kept. There are things I was going to tell you about that morning, about what I said to him, and what I think he understood, and whether a horse can miss a man.